Okay. Um, Someone mentioned the sons of God in Genesis 6, and so I want to go through that just very briefly here. Um, First thing I want you to notice is that Genesis 6, verse 1, doesn't say that, or verse 2 says, and the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Doesn't say angels, it says the sons of God. So that's what we're going to look at, the sons of God, for just a minute. And verse 1, starting in verse 1, I'm going to read verse 1 to 28 through 30. And then, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all they choose. And these sons of God were not angels, by the way, though, since angels do not marry. But we read in Matthew 22, verses 28 through 30, it says, therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the seven? For they all had her. And Jesus answered and said unto them, you do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. So Mark tells us the same in Mark chapter 12, verse 25. It states, for when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. So speaking of angels, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14 states, are they not all ministering spirits? So as you can see, angels are spirit beings, while women are of flesh. They are two different kinds of beings. Also, look at Psalms 104, verse 4, who maketh his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire. So, kinds reproduce after kind, and the different species cannot be interbred. Look at Genesis 1, verses 11, and I'm going to read 12 and 21, 24, and 25. And it states in verse 11, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit yielding tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And then in verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And then in verse 21, it says, and God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And in verse 24, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping things, and the beasts of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beast of the earth, in verse 25, and God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth. And just remember that, everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So we'll go on down and read Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, and it states that, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. See, for man, he is also flesh. So in this verse, it is clear he is speaking of fleshly mankind and not angels. So these sons of God were clearly not regenerated Christians, and they could not have been angels, and therefore it should be clear that they were human members of mankind in general, and those that had forsaken God and were intermarrying, going against God's law. To be sure, There are some angels referred to as sons of God in Job chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 38, verse 7, for example. And then there are Christians referred to as sons of God in John chapter 1, verse 2, and Romans chapter 8, verse 14, and Philippians chapter 2, verse 15, and 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And then sons of God are also referred to as mankind in general, as in Psalms 82, verses 6 through 7, Malachi chapter 2, verse 10, and Luke chapter 3, verse 38. So what about the giants, the Nephilim? We see them mentioned in Genesis 6:4, and that states there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old men of renown. So the word giants, or in Hebrew Nephilim, does not mean being tall and muscular, but does refer to a cultural leadership. And these are people that have a large influence and were establishing evil and being deceitful and violent and were enslaving the leadership. In other words, they had a bad reputation. And this is one of the reasons for the flood of Noah's time. And then verse 4 also shows us that the giants existed after the sons of God married the daughters of men, which implies they existed beforehand too. So this passage does not state that these giants were the result only of these marriages, that they have been around throughout recorded history, both before and after the flood and on down to the modern days. So now looking back at Genesis 1 through 4, we see in verse 1, men beginning to multiply on the face of the earth. And then in verse 3, the Lord said that the spirit shall not strive with man forever. And then in verse 4, we will see the giants or Nephilim were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So the children of these unions were men, not some half demon and half man, as some suppose. We also see the word giants or Nephilim mentioned when Moses tells us of what the spies he sent out saw. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, and he says, and there we saw the giants. This is the spies coming back, reporting to Moses. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. And so we were in their sight. And so this is a hyperbole that tells us that the Anakims looked down upon them with the utmost contempt. So if any demon had sex with Eve and bore Cain, what would that mean? It would mean that Cain nor his descendants could ever be saved. The good news is that this did not happen. Genesis 4:1 clearly tells us that Adam is the father of Cain. And so all mankind is descended from Adam and Eve. We're also told that Adam lived to be 930 years old. And from that, we could guess that Eve also lived to that age. In the book of Genesis, chapter 4, verse 25, we see that after Abel died, Eve had another son. And we also know from Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, that Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old. So the Bible, seldom tells us about the birth of women. And all we know for sure is that Cain is the first male child mentioned in the Bible. However, it does not necessarily follow that he was the first male child, as some claim. The Bible doesn't tell us how old Cain was when he murdered Abel. But since Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old, it had to be shortly before that time. And this allows plenty of time for many children to be born prior to the time that Cain slew Abel. During that time, their DNA wasn't so messed up as it did become later, and God allowed brother and sister to be married, become husband and wife for several years until he finally put a stop to it. In addition, the fear that Cain had of being slain, in Genesis 4:14, he was afraid that people would slay him. If he was afraid that people would slay him, then there had to be other people there besides Abel. So that implies that there were many other relatives in existence at that time. And Cain and Abel were not the only children of Adam and Eve. Only near relatives would have sought to take revenge on Cain for the death of Abel. And the mark was put on Cain, and he went off into the land of Nod. So what about the angels that left their first estate? In Isaiah 45:18, we're told, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else." So he created it not in vain, but to be inhabited. So in Genesis 1:1, we're told that God created the heavens and the earth. And in Genesis 1:2 tells us that, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water." These verses tell us that God created the heaven and earth not in vain. Yet we see in Genesis 1:2 that the earth is in chaos. What caused the earth to become chaotic? Man had not yet been created until the sixth day of the remaking of the earth. And in 1 Corinthians 15:45, we find that Adam was the first man. And then in Genesis, we find that Eve was the mother of all living human beings. So there was no race prior to Adam and Eve. So next we'll take a look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, which states, "For if God spared the angels that sinned," and we can see that it matches with Jude 1, verse 6, and that states, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." So the original creation of the earth, it was the angels that sinned and brought destruction upon the earth. And Jude 1:6 tells us what happened to them. And then when God remade the earth and began anew with Adam and Eve, where the first humans were to live on earth. We also see that Satan was already there in the Garden of Eden, waiting to influence Eve to sin. And this reply could be 10 times longer, but I hope this has answered people's concerns, and I ask that God would bless you in your studies to find the truth of his word. And I thank you for listening.